Tom Keating is the founding director of the Centre for Finance and Security at RUSI. According to The Economist, Tom Keating is one of a small group of white-collar vigilantes and poachers-turned-gamekeepers. Tom's research focuses on matters at the intersection of finance and security, including the use of finance as a tool of intelligence and disruption. He has a master's in intelligence and international security from King's College London, where his research focused on the effectiveness of the global counter-terror finance regime. Prior to joining RUSI in 2014, he was an investment banker for 20 years at JP Morgan. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like, subscribe, and definitely add a comment. Also, check out the validated Ukrainian charities that appear in the description video. I say this every time, but it is incredibly important to help Ukrainians remain resilient under the pressure they're getting on every front, social, military, and informational. Also consider buying me a coffee or become a patron. We are going to start putting more material onto the channel, special exclusive material, transcriptions of the best in Russian language journalism to make it accessible to an English language audience. So please do check that out. Tom, welcome to the channel.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, a fascinating comment, one that really jumped out, that sort of initiated me to get in contact, was in the context, I think, quite a sort of outspoken comment. You'd been to Berlin, I understand, in one of these, extraordinary forward-looking, future-looking conferences, and you came back and said, look, there are far more near-term things that need to be sorted out. Ukraine needs to win. There's no point in talking about reconstruction unless Ukraine can secure victory. Could you go into more details about why you think these longer-term conversations get more focus perhaps than they warrant at this time, and the short-term requirements not as much as they need?
Yes, the bit I didn't put in that LinkedIn post was the go I had at the two people sitting next to me on the BA flight back from Berlin. Apologies to them, because they sat there having one of these kind of long-term discussions, and I couldn't prevent myself from turning to them and saying, guys, everything you're talking about is fine, but if there's no Ukraine, then everything you're talking about is pointless. And they were talking actually about environmental sustainability. And I said, actually what we want in certain parts of Ukraine right now is massive environmental damage, with stuff coming out of the air and destroying Russian positions. So I was very depressed in Berlin. And I felt that there was a disconnect between the reality on the ground. I have a team member based in Ukraine, and I'm afraid a common email from her these days is, sorry, we're going to have electricity blackouts. I won't be able to join, the Teams call today. And I think the reality on the ground, unfortunately, is a little bit lost on many policymakers, many do-gooders, in a positive way, I say that, who convened in Berlin at the Ukraine Recovery Conference. So just helping Ukraine survive is not acceptable. We need to help Ukraine win, and that's really the change in narrative and thinking that I would certainly like to be pushing forward as much as possible.
And we're in an election cycle. As we were talking before we hit record, I'm moderating an election debate, but geopolitics hasn't featured prominently in the election. And in fact, whereas Britain has been a little more forward in supporting Ukraine, verbally, if not materially, we still do not hear the absolute commitment that Ukraine must win. And we certainly have not really heard it out of Washington or Berlin, at least not in explicit terms.
Yes, one of the things that struck us while we were in Berlin on our recent trip was the extent to which we had a meeting in the Bundestag, and the extent to which people were apologizing for the politics. We have fragmented politics in Germany, our ability to make any decisions. And this was just after the European Parliament elections, which obviously, triggered some degree of political chaos in France and so on. So the politics, unfortunately, at the moment, doesn't seem to be going in Ukraine's favor. That's not that people are objecting to supporting Ukraine or the rest of it, but you don't feel as though leaders are willing to put their shoulder to the wheel. Now, in the UK, obviously, the discussions of defense and security and foreign policy just haven't featured in the election at all, unsurprisingly, I suppose. But what concerns me a little bit is that we get into a kind of stagnated situation where, well, it's all happening in Ukraine, and we're sending them weapons and they're surviving. But what we've lacked in recent months is political leaders standing up and saying it is critical Ukraine wins. And rather than this narrative of we will support Ukraine for as long as it takes, I would like to hear people say we will support Ukraine to win as quickly as possible. As long as it takes makes it sound like this is a marathon. And actually, that feels marginally defeatist and sort of accepting that we're in a long haul. Yes, we should support them for as long as it takes, but as long as it takes needs to be as quickly as possible, if that makes sense.
And it's an extraordinary, isn't it, that one of the reasons, I mean, there's political deadlocks, there's fragility, there's, as some have pointed out, sort of democratic decline, which means that Western governments neither have the leadership nor perhaps the mandate to take these sort of bold decisions. But there's also a clear strategy of elongating or prolonging the war, and it's been labeled escalation management, the theory being that if you create a long attritional war, it will grind Russia down, Russia will become less of a threat. I mean, there are some people who never agreed with this strategy, and it seems in reality it's doing the opposite effect. Russia is getting more toxic, more brutal, more desperate, but they're also rebuilding their army, and they're learning, and they're developing capability and creating alliances. It seems to be escalating the chaos, not mitigating the risk.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that Putin and his military have both metaphorically and literally dug in. And if you look at the way in which he has changed his leadership, I mean, one of the things I find very interesting is the way, we now have somebody who is fundamentally a finance guy running the Ministry of Defense in Moscow. That suggests to me that we are in for a long haul as far as the Kremlin looks at this, and that finance, I mean, that's obviously the thing that I'm particularly interested in, that getting the finances right is the sine qua non for victory or whatever objective Putin might have. And I mean, it makes sense because in the West, we are very bad at sort of maintaining focus on a topic. I mean, to be honest, I'm surprised we've maintained focus on Ukraine for as long as we have done, particularly in the face of other things going on in the world, like the kind of barbaric Hamas attacks in Israel. So, well done us for maintaining focus, but we're going to have to maintain focus for considerably longer. The other thing that concerns me a little bit is that, obviously we are in the midst of elections all over Europe, all over the world, indeed. And, I think that at some point, and it's happened in some places already, but at some point, populists are going to say, well, why are we spending all your taxpayers' money on Ukraine? And, there are things we can do to mitigate that. And I'm particularly passionate about the use of the central bank assets, the Russian central bank assets. But I do fear, and we might see that in spades in November in the United States, I do kind of fear as though Putin basically has to outweight us, and we mustn't let him win that strategy.
Let's dig into the central bank assets, because you read my mind. That was going to be my next question. Timothy Ash has been on the channel a number of times, and he went through some sums. Now, maths isn't my strong point, but he explained that over the next 2 years, not just paying off the interest to Ukraine, which is, I believe, in the order of 50 billion, but the entire 300 billion sum, that would essentially bankroll Ukraine for the next 2 years of war, assuming this is going to be a long haul that covers the next 2 years. Russia potentially does not have the assets to keep going for longer than that. What are the chances? What needs to change minds and policies to get those central bank assets fully given over to Ukraine and aligned with the concept of victory?
So the first thing to say on all of this is that this is an EU issue. I mean, we can cheerlead from the UK, the US can prod and nudge, but fundamentally the EU has to be comfortable with whatever happens. And we all know that the EU moves slowly and incrementally. But to be fair to the European Union, it's like a one-way ratchet. It gets there eventually. it tends not to backslide. And so whilst, and I fully agree with Tim, and we sort of violently agree on this topic together regularly at conferences and so on. I think the EU had to be allowed a first intermediate step, and the intermediate step is bigger than it looked as though it would be at one point. I mean, it's more bold, to use the cliche, from the EU than perhaps many of us feared. But yes, more money is going to be needed. $50 billion euros is not going to last very long. And so the next question is, can we get the political leaders in the EU and Christine Lagarde, the president of the European Central Bank and guardian of the sort of the euro, can we get them to dip into the actual assets themselves rather than just use the income that the assets are earning? That has to be the mission over the next 6 or so months. I think the legal arguments have long been put to bed. What now really is needed is political leadership. We are going to do this. Because, by the way, if we don't do this with the central bank assets, then we're going to be asking European taxpayers to foot the bill, and that's going to become increasingly unpalatable.
And there's an interesting sort of parallel argument in the US when the 60 billion aid package was being discussed. And we know that actually not an awful lot of that is going to go directly to Ukraine. And a lot of it is to rebuild US reserves, create logistics supplies, pay for various roles throughout Europe to support in the provision of that weaponry. It's quite a complex picture. But the designation of that was turned from being essentially giving it to Ukraine to classifying it as a loan. And that was a piece of political expediency that seemed to get it over the line. This comes back to your earlier point. If Ukraine doesn't exist, that can never be repaid. And it's the same with many of the sort of European support. European leaders, Western leaders must be hoping that at some point Ukraine is victorious and the economic benefits of a free market, free Ukraine will bring dividends back into the Western system at some point. If it doesn't exist, none of that will happen.
Yes, I mean, I've heard lots of forward thinking. I haven't yet heard anyone go, well, let's imagine a sort of, flourishing economy, which is going to be, a sort of a net positive for the European Union or whatever it might be. So I think, a lot of the thinking, weirdly, I'm going to contradict myself. A lot of the thinking is very short term, but actually a lot of the thinking is also very long term, almost too long term. And there doesn't seem to be a lot in the middle, I suppose. So the bottom line is that we owe Ukraine. Ukraine is doing us all a favor, and that's not to sort of downplay by using that language. Ukraine is providing an invaluable service, an invaluable sacrifice for Europe, and we need to support them the maximum amount, and that will require us making certain decisions that we as Europeans feel uncomfortable about. The first one is raiding the central bank assets. I just think it's unconscionable that will not happen at some point over the next 6 to 12 months. The second one, though, is on sanctions, where we still are very reactive in the way we use sanctions because we are concerned about the blowback on our own economies. And in this lies a critical point. I had the chance to, just before the election was called, I gave evidence to the Treasury Select Committee, which is the finance committee in the Parliament in the UK. And I said, the thing we have not yet adapted to and acknowledged is Russia sees itself at economic war with the West. It has organized itself on a war footing to deal with the financial threats coming from the West. We have not yet mirrored that in our thinking. We don't think of ourselves as at economic war with Russia. We've still got diplomats dealing with sanctions and so on. There is nobody sitting there saying, in an MOD saying, finance is one of my attack points. How am I going to use this? We're constantly behind the curve. And that, I think, is something we need to recognize. We will have to damage our own economies if we want to support the Ukrainians.
And interesting, there are a number of measures that wouldn't even damage the economy, but it seems that we're pulling our punches. The example, I was watching some videos by Vladimir Milov, who's a Russian economics expert, and talking to some of the people on my channel I regularly talk to, who have connections still back to Russia. And it seems that the secondary sanctions, or tightening up the threats of those who are breaking secondary sanctions, has had a huge impact and almost crashed the Russian economy. The currency went sort of crazy for a period, and there were lines outside, exchange bureau. It seems from that incident that if we got serious about the sanctions there already are and imposed, certain penalties, we could isolate the Russian economy far more than we currently are, and the blowback would be fairly minimal on Western economies. Why are we pulling our punches? Or do we just not, is there not the will or the realization that we have that power?
My favorite game at the moment is to go to Brussels and try and get bureaucrats to use the word extraterritoriality in a positive way. Otherwise, no, our sanctions aren't extraterritorial. We can't possibly use the fact that we are the world's biggest trading bloc to put pressure on country X, country Y to choose sides. And this is my point about, I think, not realizing that we are at economic war with Russia. If you are at war with somebody, you don't sort of incrementally increase your defenses or increase your attacks. You make sure that it's existential. You use everything you possibly have. And I think when it comes to sanctions, the strategy has been, well, let's try that. Let's poke there and let's poke there and see what happens. Not enough's happening. Let's try poking a bit more, rather than saying, what is the knockout punch? Now, there are consequences, because if you start using secondary sanctions against a whole bunch of banks in the Middle East or something, you're going to have diplomatic issues to deal with when you next talk to the Emiratis or the Georgians or whatever it might be, the Kazakhs. But the bottom line is that if we push hard enough, we can create major damage to the Russian economy. The problem is what we're doing is we're nudging, and like a weeble, it's standing up again. And then we're nudging again, and it goes like that, and then it comes back again, because they are adapting, and they're very good at that. They really are very good at that.
And we can get on in a minute to topics like the Grey Fleet. Russia is also, it seems, not averse to creating an anti-economy, a set of, an anti-world order, and creating these sort of networks. I mean, there's no morality there. There's no limits around or concerns for the environment or anything. They've got carte blanche to behave like a mafia state. And that seems to have allowed them to circumvent a lot of the sanctions that we've tried to put in place.
Yes, I mean, fundamentally, sorry to repeat myself, but these are existential steps for them. So, you know what? 5 years ago, the idea of Russia cozying up to North Korea would have been in breach of UN Security Council resolutions and this norm and the Council of Europe, that and everything else. They don't care. They don't care because they need the ammunition. They need the weaponry, the support, the connections. And because that is the primary goal, they just sweep aside all the norms that we think govern proper behavior on the international stage. And there is a growing community of what we think of as a kind of axis of adversaries. They team up when it's helpful. They're not necessarily all sitting down sort of in some cavern somewhere and plotting against the West. But fundamentally, where it is helpful, they will team up. And finance and economics are two of the areas, and trade. They're the areas where they know they need to work together, because it remains a field where, despite the rise of China and everything, the bottom line is the West has, in theory, all the cards. And so it helps Iran, North Korea, China to some extent, Russia, to kind of work together to create this kind of anti-economy or whatever you want to call it.
And something else you wrote, which I find absolutely fascinating, because I've been following this through the war with increasing incredulity, and that is on the geopolitical side, that there's very definitely those who think that morality should play a role in geopolitics, and there's schools of thinking that say it shouldn't, that it's all about sort of power relations. The same applies to, it seems, corporate life. And whereas you've got large corporations who are quite happy to pinkwash and greenwash their narratives and pretend that they care deeply about all sorts of social issues, they are prepared to still work in Russia pay huge amounts to the Russian treasury, directly pay for the creation of missiles and bombs that are killing Ukrainians. And these companies have been named. Unilever is one of them, and there are many others. Unilever, of course, British companies name it, but there are many others throughout Europe and the US as well. You have mentioned here that something quite interesting is going on. The banks have learned to fear sanctions and secondary sanctions, but manufacturers and exporters seem to currently not really get it.
Yes, back to that Treasury Select Committee hearing I spoke at, I think I said there that manufacturers need to realize that an increase in sales to Kazakhstan is not necessarily a reason to go to the pub and celebrate. And again, this is another area where this whole concept of being at economic war is not visible. So one of the arguments against grabbing all the central bank assets, for example, is, well, what might they do to the companies of ours that are still in Russia? Well, too bad. It's 2.5 years. You should have been out of there ages ago. And if it's too difficult for you to extricate yourself because of whatever particular tax or what have you reason, that's a cost you're just going to have to absorb. I think most companies have written down the value of their assets in Russia to zero already. So, enough that's just not an acceptable argument that this far into the conflict. But the other point I make in this particular area is that historically, when we think about sanctions, we think about financial sanctions, we think about asset freezes, kicking Russian banks out of the capital markets, whatever it might be. Actually, sanctions at the moment are really export controls on speed, right? We are trying to stop the Russians getting the kit they need. The money, to some extent, is secondary. But the community that we're relying on in order to enforce those export controls don't have the familiarity with sanctions that banks have. There isn't a sanctions compliance officer in every small and medium-sized enterprise that's making widgets. And therefore, what we're finding is that whereas a bank faced with a 50-50 decision will say, you know what, that way lies bad juju if I say yes to that trade. Actually, corporates are more likely to go, extra sales, what's not to like? The last point I make is, when did you last hear a Ministry of Trade or a Department of Trade in any government say, we help our companies trade responsibly and cautiously and look out for red flags around the world? You don't hear that, do you? The British government, we want to sign trade deals and, trade all around the world. Anyone who gets in the way of trade is a party pooper. So we have to work to change that mentality, because I think taking a financial sanctions approach to what is essentially an export controls battle just doesn't mix.
And again, it seems that we perhaps underestimate the power we have here, and the realization that finance, trade, and geopolitics have that kind of linkage. And it's interesting to see that China, ostensibly an ally of Russia's, they would benefit from a Russian win. They'd benefit from a Russian defeat, which is quite clever positioning. But they don't seem to be falling over themselves to create alternative, financial mechanisms for Russia to trade, now that the avenues of trading in sort of hard Western currency are starting to be sort of blocked off. In fact, it seems that certain, Chinese entities are withdrawing rather than increasing their these systems or mechanisms to enable the Russian economy. That's quite an extraordinary development, and one which I see very little reporting on, except, of course, Milov and others of Russian commentators who are looking at this stuff in more detail.
So I think that the Chinese economy, and we have to recognize that basically means a Chinese state, but I think that to some extent they're talking out of both sides of their mouth. So China needs a stable, healthy global economy. That's clear. And the volatility and economic damage caused by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine cannot have been popular in China. I think we can safely say that. If you are a big Chinese corporate or you're a big Chinese bank, what's your choice? Facilitate trade and finance with Russia, or continue to trade and finance the rest of the world? Economically speaking, it's a no-brainer. You're going to prioritize the rest of the world over Russia, unless the leadership in China says, hang on a minute, we need to support Russia, which is why you've historically seen China pursue a strategy that I call the burner bank strategy, which is basically to set up small banks that have one purpose only. So there's an example of this bank called Kunlun Bank, which was basically set up to facilitate trade with Iran. And it got sanctioned to hell by the Americans, but it didn't matter because it had no other role in life than facilitating trade with Iran. So I think we might see more of that from the Chinese. The other thing I would point to, and hats off to an unnamed journalist who I was talking to about this recently, China has recently announced a big program of international bond issuance denominated in RMB, long-dated bonds. Now, who is going to buy long-dated RMB denominated bonds? Might it be a country like Russia that has been selling hydrocarbons to China, has been being paid in RMB, not in dollars because of the sanctions risk, and is wondering what to do with that Chinese currency? Oh, guess what? Invest it in bonds issued by the Chinese state. So speculation, but I think those are the kinds of examples I would point to where China is being quite smart in playing both sides of the game.
And some people watching this will say, hang on a second, here's a British podcaster pointing fingers all around the world. We don't have to look far from home, though. Londongrad was a huge enabler of the Russian oligarch system, the cleansing of dirty money. And that, to an extent, rebounded, let's be honest, on our politics and our society. It created an incentive for us not to really push back against Russia and really try to deal with what was going on, including Litvinenko, Skripal, and all these other things. So I'd love to hear your view about Londongrad and the toxic effect it had, but also how do we prevent a new Londongrad from developing in any post-war order?
The person who has contributed the most to the advancement of the response to economic crime and illicit finance in the UK in recent years, the person who's contributed the most to that mission is Vladimir Putin, because it was not until he ordered the invasion of Ukraine that parliamentarians, or leadership, I should say, in the government, many parliamentarians have been seized of the matter for a long time, but the leadership in the government made the space and the time to bring forward legislation so we had 2 rounds of economic crime legislation introduced in the UK almost immediately in 2022, following the full-scale invasion, and then in 2023. That people like me and others in civil society have been calling for that for years and years and years, but nothing was being done. So there was a delinquency in the government on that topic. Quite certainly. I mean, that's a fact. So yes, things have started. The one thing that I would want to emphasize is that there was a kind of joy in sanctioning oligarchs in February, March, April, May 2022, and I'm not going to lose any sleep over the sanctioning of oligarchs, but it did smack rather of crumbs. We've got a chance here to make up for lost time and to take steps against Abramovich and Deripaska and co. So the question is, so now what? Are we going to clean up the system? So as you say, the next generation of oligarchs or kleptocrats don't find London attractive. I think there's some quite good hope in there. So we're seeing reforms of Companies House to try and make it more difficult to set up spurious companies where the director is Mickey Mouse. You can't own property easily in the UK anymore through an offshore company. So there are things happening like that which are addressing the sort of the meat and potatoes of international kleptocracy. But we clearly need to now confiscate assets from people. We need to set some examples, just in the way as seeing banks punished set an example to me when I worked at JP Morgan. I thought, crumbs, I better mind my P's and Q's. We need to set a degree of deterrence here. And that's where I think the UK struggles, is actually maintaining sufficient focus on prosecuting oligarchs, confiscating assets, whatever it may be, and remembering that this cannot be a Russia exclusive topic, right? Kleptocracy is not a Russian problem. It is a global problem that the UK has facilitated. And so we need to become part of the solution rather than merely part of the problem.
And someone you'll know well, Oliver Buller, was on the channel just over a year ago and came up with the fascinating idea that by taking oligarch money, by taking kleptocrat money, we're creating a disincentive for judicial reform in the countries they're from. Because if they have a safe haven for their money, what is the incentive to introduce rule of law, probity, level playing field, all this kind of stuff in their home territories? Do you think that is more important than ever now, especially if we're going to push back to the Kremlin? We need to do it not just with force, but based on a consistent set of values as well.
I think that's right. I mean, I get a bit antsy when I hear particularly politicians sort of talking about British values and we need to kind of it sounds a bit colonial sometimes. I mean I certainly find that going and my office is on Whitehall and I regularly go to places around the world. I hand up my business card and there are occasions where people look at my business card, particularly former colonies of the United Kingdom, and they go, Whitehall. You should know, young man, that we don't have a good history with people coming to visit us from Whitehall. And then I have to explain that I'm from a think tank, I'm not from the British government. But my point is that I think we have to be quite careful how we lecture the rest of the world. And actually, you see this in the financial crime world. There's this body called the Financial Action Task Force, which is sort of the global watchdog, global standard setter. And in recent years, the kind of fragmentation of geopolitics that we've seen affect the United Nations and kind of other international bodies has also started to affect this community. People saying, well, hang on a minute, why should I be doing what you in London or Washington tell me to do in Africa? I've got my own issues. I've got issues of post-COVID recovery. I've got issues of climate change. I've got issues of, burglary and rape, so don't get all highfalutin with me. So I think we have to kind of find what is it that these countries want help with and help them with it. And, sometimes actually, I think we might have to hold our nose because, of course, if we try and impose our standards on them, they just turn around and go, well, thank you very much, but the Chinese will give me all the help I need and they're not going to ask me all these difficult questions about safeguarding. So I think we have to be quite cautious in the way we approach this. The thing that I would say, and I thought you were going to put these words into Oliver's mouth, is that we mustn't view sanctioning kleptocrats as the end of the process. It's the beginning of the process. The assets are frozen. Now we need to prove that they are the proceeds of corruption or the proceeds of crime and confiscate them and then return them to Angola or Kenya or Nigeria or wherever they've come from. That's the critical bit. And that's what these countries look for. I mean, I to go off on a tangent, but I found myself in Moldova at some point last year. And the one thing everyone wanted to tell me was, oh, we're so pleased with the United Kingdom. They've returned some assets to us. And I went away and looked into this, and it was a few £100,000, so better than nothing, but nothing compared to probably what we should be doing. But the fact that we had returned money was what mattered.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? And actually, if you listen to many of the Russian opposition, they don't have a problem with the central bank assets being frozen. In fact, they are imploring the West to do it because they want Putin defeated faster. I'll just add that in as a kind of note to our previous discussion because, all sorts of legal, arguments are thrown up that it'll set a bad precedent. But Russian opposition are desperate for this to happen and for the tyranny in Russia to be defeated as soon as possible. Talking of bad reputations or reputations that need some love and attention, UK's relationship with Europe is something that perhaps the next government needs to pay some attention to, especially in order to help grow the economy and so on. But how is the war changing Europe's relationship with the world and the UK's relationship with Europe, especially on crucial issues such as defence and security?
Yeah, so I have to say, someone in the UK mission in Brussels said to me, and I'm sort of paraphrasing, but basically said, you know what, the one desk in this mission where you don't feel Brexit is the sanctions desk, because I actually think that the UK and the EU has worked together extremely closely on pretty much every element of the Ukraine file. And we regularly get the chance to visit various kind of EU member state capitals. And it's interesting how often we find ourselves turning up, the week after a delegation from HM Treasury or the Foreign Office have been to visit to talk about how to effectively implement sanctions. So I actually think, in a way, it's an area of great cooperation. great coordination, and it's been a boom for cross-channel relations. I think the other thing which I'd point to is, of course, specifically on sanctions, the EU moves very slowly. You obviously got the kind of herding of the 27 cats to come to a conclusion, and all the trouble that goes into building consensus there. So I think the UK probably has had an outsized role in this field, because we have been able to make decisions more quickly, more dynamically, more like the United States. So, and there are certainly cases that I'm well aware of where kind of the EU has let it be known that they're struggling to get to a conclusion on a certain sanctions topic, but it would be great if the United States and the UK could sort of step in and do the dirty for them. So I would say that and again, I don't want to make light of a really tragic situation, but actually the war in Ukraine has been of a benefit to the UK from an international relations perspective. I mean, look at the way Boris sort of strode the globe in the early days of the full-scale invasion. For the new government, if there is a new government and it's a Labour government, I think the jury is out. I'm sure they will be fully supportive. But kind of how they will approach the topic beyond business as usual, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see.
It's tricky, isn't it? And one of the key questions here is, irrespective of the internal economic position, which of course is highly divisive, has Brexit weakened Britain's role within the Euro-Atlantic alliance, or has it, created opportunities like the one you just described?
I'm sure it's a bit of both. I mean, if you go to the Baltic states, people have great fondness for, the kind of the British NATO contribution, for example. So I think on the face of it, the UK is still a meaningful player in international relations. It's a respected, perhaps more so than it should be, a respected player in the defence world. And so on balance, I would say this is an area where the UK can play more than just a sort of supporting role. I mean, of course, who knows what happens in the United States in their election in November, but I suspect the UK will probably play some sort of role in whatever the fallout is of an election in the United States in November. So I feel it's an opportunity for the UK. Of course, it's an opportunity the UK should not have. There should not be a war in Ukraine, clearly. But I think it's something that I would expect whoever is in Downing Street from the 5th of July to use to their advantage. I mean, it's a place where the UK is welcomed, I suppose, in the defence and security community in a way that perhaps is not welcomed in sort of trade discussions in Brussels.
Nonetheless, though, we do not seem to be rearming as if we are in what could be the early stages of World War III. Now, that might sound contentious, but we're about potentially to see North Korean engineers, potentially soldiers on the ground on European territory. We're faced with an extraordinary crisis, the scale of which I don't think has been seen since the Second World War. This could or could not turn into World War III, but it's not a totally outlandish idea. What needs to happen, essentially, certainly in Britain and Europe, but especially in Britain, in order to take seriously not just our 2.5% commitment to defence, but looking to what do we actually need to be doing in terms of the scale, size of our armed forces, retooling factories, even thinking about the kind of capabilities we'll need in the era of electronic and drone warfare. The impression I get from my various conversations is we are not doing any of these things. By all means, prove me wrong if you think that's not correct.
No, look, I'm not going to say very much in reply, basically, because I'm sort of skating outside my my area of expertise. But if you were to look at the work of colleagues of mine at RUSI, like Jack Watling and co in the military sciences part of our research program, then I think they would agree wholeheartedly with your assessment. And I come back to this, sorry to be a stuck record, but I come back to this point, which is that we are still, I think, approaching the threats thrown up by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We're still approaching it with a kind of technical mindset. And yes, we need an industrial strategy, which means that we can produce, I don't know, Javelin anti-tank missiles at the rate that's necessary to restock what we've donated to Ukraine and to prepare ourselves for whatever might come next. And we simply don't have the industry set up to deal with the challenge that could be coming over the hill. Now, we should be viewing it as an insurance policy and doing that now. And you know what? If we don't need it, well, that's a relief. We might have spent money that we didn't need to spend. But I think the Western alliance risks appearing as though the cupboard is bare just at the point when it really needs the cupboard to be fully stocked. So this is something, I think we should be thinking about. Again, the UK is very capable in that kind of production. It's just we haven't focused ourselves in the way that I think is necessary. Perhaps that will be part of the future industrial strategy of a new government. Who knows? We'll have to wait and see for what comes next.
And in the last of two questions, I'm going to end on a question that talks about a post-conflict Ukraine. I know we started by saying that that's not the conversation we should be having at the moment. We'll end on maybe a sort of visionary, positive piece. But before we get there, we've talked about financial resilience. We've just talked about military resilience. But Russia has shown it's adept at a multi-channel, multi-front assault. What should we be doing? And this is an area I'm increasingly going to get into, which is fighting disinformation. What should we do in creating informational resilience?
While we've been talking, an email has popped into my inbox from the Hybrid Center of Excellence in Helsinki. And I think places like that are going to be more and more important. I think so. It's very interesting. I don't know a lot about Finland, but I know that in Finland that they basically kind of teach this sort of skepticism at mis and disinformation to children. And I think that's what we're talking about here. I think we need a degree of kind of education, public service broadcasting, all that kind of stuff, which actually gets people to think about what it is they are consuming from an informational perspective. We're very, very vulnerable to this kind of messaging, which is so easy for the Russians to project and to kind of undermine trust in our democracy and our leaders, and basically wage some sort of psychological warfare on us. So I was never a Boy Scout, but I believe be prepared is the chant, and I think that's what we should be thinking about. I do think that a new government, a new European Commission, whatever it is that comes down the road, needs to recognize that there are societal issues that we need to address in order to prepare ourselves for the worst, not to be a doomster, but I think we need to take that seriously. And I think there's a lot we can learn from, for example, the Baltic countries. They all kind of know where to go should the worst happen. They're constantly thinking about how to deal with the aggravation that comes through, the kind of Russian-speaking population in their country, or whatever it might be. They've been grappling with these issues. I think in the UK, it's easy to feel isolated on our island. We're not in the front line geographically. We haven't been occupied as recently as 1991, as the Baltic states and others have been. So I think actually we ought to listen to those countries. Guys, what would you advise us to be doing when it comes to societal resilience? Because I don't think we have the answers. I think others have the answers. And that's, again, another area for integration and working together within Europe.
That leaves the last question. We've only got a few minutes left, but let's assume that Ukrainian victory is the most important thing. But following that, there will be a post-conflict environment with a huge amount of challenges. Where can the UK help, and what should the priorities be for Ukrainian recovery, assuming that has to happen not just environmental and economic, but also in the sense of security as well?
Yeah, so we have a specific project from my team, which we called SMURF, which stands for Supervising and Monitoring Ukraine's Reconstruction Funding. And I think the confidence of a population in those sort of situations is so important. If you see people lining their pockets and buying properties in London and benefiting from the reconstruction process, I think that's going to be terrible for sort of national psyche. So I certainly think that although I started off by saying we need to worry about the short term and not the long term, we clearly need to make sure that the processes are in place to make sure that we have a sort of a integrity in the in any reconstruction and sort of Marshall Plan type process that would be needed. And it's going to be huge. It's going to be huge, and I think need to recognize that. We need to do whatever we can to sort of help Ukraine accelerate through that process. And I think the UK needs to play its part in doing that. I think there's a lot the UK can offer in terms of industrial capability and financial capability and all those sorts of things. But we need to do that and ensure there's integrity in the system. So that's the kind of thing that, I hope it happens soon, and I hope to be fully involved.
And last interesting point there, Ukraine is becoming, and this isn't really covered much at all, it's becoming one of the world leaders in e-governance and transparency in procurement processes using electronic systems. Is there something we could potentially learn from that experience, given that our own defense procurement is not always efficient, let's say?
I mean, I'm amazed by what the Ukrainians have developed, the Prozoro procurement system, the Dream system they have. They've developed so much, the Dear app that they run their lives on from their phones. So absolutely. And I think, in a way, that's what we should be thinking about. We should be thinking about how do we engage with Ukraine? How do we make Ukraine and Ukrainians feel that there is a future that they can be part of? Not just that they are the victims of the Kremlin's unjust war. So, and if ever you need a drone pilot, there's only one place to hire a drone pilot these days, right? I mean, it's extraordinary what they've done over the last 2.5 years, and I hope that they can put that to positive use as soon as possible, rather than as part of this this existential fight that they face.
Well, Tom, it's a huge privilege to speak to you, and actually thrilling conversation as well. Lots of new ground covered that we haven't talked about in previous podcasts. So I'm very grateful to you for coming on. I hope to repeat the experience, and thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.